Welcome, listeners, to the Electric Wire podcast. I'm your host, Kristen Jilks, Executive Director of the Customers First Coalition. Customers First is a coalition to preserve Wisconsin's affordable and reliable power. And given the recent headlines out of Texas following prolonged power outages and massive customer bills, we wanted to dedicate this episode to addressing some of the underlying problems with the deregulated Texas energy system that caused these outages when customers needed power the most. We've assembled a panel of industry experts to give their take on what happened in Texas, including John Carr of Dairyland Power Cooperative, Paul Griffin of Energy Fairness, and Loehr of Perkins Coie law firm here in Madison, Wisconsin. Without further delay, I'm going to turn you over to our panel. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to the Electric Wire so you never miss an episode. We're starting off our roundtable with John Carr. John is the Vice President of Power Supply at Dairyland Power Cooperative. John, thanks for joining, and tell us some more about your role at Dairyland.
Thanks, and thanks for having me on the program. So in my role at Dairyland, I oversee our actual generation plant operations. So our power plants producing power. I also manage our resources in the MISO energy market. So market similar to ERCOT that we'll be talking more about later, I'm sure. And then our resource planning function. So Dairyland is embarking on a journey to diversify our resource mix and to reduce our CO2 imprint. And that's part of my role here. So glad to be part of the program.
Thank you so much, John. And Paul, welcome.
Hi there.
Paul, I want to know more about Energy Fairness. Who are your members, and what is it that you guys do over at Energy Fairness?
Oh, sure. Thank you for the opportunity. Energy Fairness is a not-for-profit that's been in existence for 11 years. We started off our existence as a partnership for affordable clean energy about 11 years ago. And our mantra is to have a conversation with policymakers and consumers about what it takes to maintain an affordable and reliable supply of electricity. Our membership is indicative of our board of directors, and the board of directors is comprised of a co-op general manager from North Florida, Mike McWaters from Suwannee Electric Cooperative, the statewide director of the Wyoming Rural Electric Association. I have a Chamber of Commerce member, and I also have a member from the Alabama AFL-CIO on my board. And my chairman is from the Tennessee River Valley Association. So we all have a stake in making sure that we have an affordable and reliable supply of energy. And just to give a little context about myself, previous to this job, I was in government relations at Tri-State Generation and Transmission Association, which is a spread out GNT across the Intermountain West, 200,000 square miles. And then I worked at NRECA for 5 years in the government relations department, handling federal power and natural resources issues. And prior to that, 5 years as a energy staffer for Congressman Greg Walden of Oregon, who just retired. That's me in a nutshell. Affordable and reliable power.
Love it. Thanks, Paul. I mean, as I read your column on Utility Dive, and then I looked into Energy Fairness a bit, and it struck me, and I see Kira kind of laughing because your board makeup is very similar to the Customers First board makeup in that we have a very diverse board membership, labor, consumer advocates, renewable energy groups. I thought that was kind of interesting that I never knew you existed until now. Okay, so Kira, welcome. Kira has been on the board of Customers First in the past. Kira, tell us more about yourself and your role at Perkins Coie and how it all relates to the energy world.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. It is exciting to see you after all this time in the pandemic.
Oh, it's been way too long.
I'm a partner at Perkins Coie, which is a Seattle-based national law firm, with a pretty sizable energy, environment, and natural resources group. And I'm part of that group here in Madison. There's 7 of us in Madison. We're one of the smaller offices that Perkins has internationally, but we're the coolest, I think. Partially because we get to work on these energy and utility issues, which is something that I've been passionate and excited about ever since It's coming up on almost 20 years now since I've been in this industry one way or another, on the consumer side, on the utility side, on the environmental side. I've been privileged to work with a variety of different groups and organizations, including Customers First. Back before I was even completed law school, I was the secretary, part-time secretary for the organization, and I'm excited to see it still here and moving forward.
Well, thanks for joining, Kira. All right, let's dive right into the questions. So the first question I have for you all: after the dust has settled a bit, power has been restored, investigations have begun, and we're starting to ask what happened in Texas and how can we prevent this type of massive, prolonged power outage from happening again. I'm going to read from an opinion piece submitted to Utility Dive by Paul Griffin, who is with us here in this roundtable. The opinion piece is called "The Real Problem in Texas Deregulation." It appeared in Utility Dive on February 24th, 2021. As extreme winter weather gripped much of Texas and millions of customers were left without power because of blackouts, national conversations took a familiar and predictable turn down partisan lines. Opponents of renewable energy pointed the finger at the state's robust wind energy, as roughly half the state's wind capacity was knocked offline. Others cast the blame on traditional thermal sources, as 30 gigawatts of generation from nuclear, coal, and natural gas were also unavailable for dispatch. In the fog of war, or winter as it were, we fear many observers may have missed the real point. It wasn't an electricity source that failed customers in Texas's mostly deregulated marketplace. It was an electricity system. That's because while regulated electricity markets are designed to serve customers, deregulated electricity markets are made to serve power providers. The result for Texas customers hasn't always been clear. Some customers have saved money under deregulation, but many have been worse off. That's because Texans in deregulated markets have paid higher average prices than those in regulated ones. In fact, one report showed that Texas customers could have saved $27 billion from 2002 through 2016 had they paid the same price as customers living in regulated parts of the state. Energy choice, it turned out, wasn't all that it seemed. Paul, since it's your column, let's start with you.
Right. Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this issue, because it's an issue that in which we've been engaged for a long time, mainly in particular in Florida, because Florida, I don't know if the rest of the panel knows this, but 2 years ago, some folks from Texas tried to import the Texas model into Florida and put a constitutional amendment to the ballot, which was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But the reason I don't like to speak in absolutes in my 45 years of life, I've learned not to do that. But I will say deregulation was one of the primary contributing factors, along with a historical bout of cold weather that the region had not seen at least since 2011. And I was reading today that temperatures fell to 18 overnight in Houston, or 13 degrees overnight in Houston, and then -3 in East Texas and Tyler, Texas. So there was record cold. But from energy fairness perspective, deregulation hit at the two things we care about the most, and that was affordability and reliability. And with respect to what happened in Texas, it made electricity unaffordable, because a lot of folks forget that are from up north, or at least I didn't know. I grew up in New England and went to school in upstate New York, but about 60% of the folks in the region have electric heat. So electric heat led to a massive, unprecedented demand for electricity from the electric heat consumers. And then that drove up energy prices to a crazy uncapped price. But from our perspective, I mean, that made energy unaffordable, but then, then the whole system became unreliable. And what we've seen with Texas over the last 20 years, I've talked to lawyers in Texas, and keep in mind that deregulation is still very popular in Texas. And even the people that speak out against deregulation in Texas will always say, look, I'm not against deregulation, because it's politically still a pretty popular issue. But you can't argue with the fact that over the last 20 years, the reliability has gone from the nation's best reserve margin the nation's worst reserve margin. And in particular, I never thought that it would be a cold snap that would take down the system. We had been screaming for the last 2 years that the peak demand and that, we thought it would be something in a massive heat wave or a prolonged heat wave in July that would eventually take down the system. And because the reserve margin was down to, I think, 7.5%, lo and behold, it was a massive cold event that took down the system and prompted all the outages that came with it. So yeah, I mean, it's I guess it's a long way of saying that, this is an issue, whether it's in Florida or whether it's in Texas, that it just does not lead to an affordable and reliable situation for consumers, given the fact that in Texas, as I pointed out in my article, Texas consumers in the deregulated market have paid $25 billion more in electric rates over the last 20 years. So that's not good. And we see when it's done to reliability. Now, like I said, it wasn't the sole responsibility for why the grid went down in Texas or why ERCOT suffered such a blackout, but it's definitely a primary contributing reason.
John, do you agree that deregulation played a role in the Texas system failures?
I think, at least from my perspective, the deregulation customer choice, it certainly exposed the price risk that consumers were taking on, whether knowingly or unknowingly. I think that's a question. The Texas market, as Paul points out, it's a very short-term market. Day ahead, next day, real time. It's very short-term focused. And we're talking about an industry where in power generation, it requires massive capital investment and cost recovery over a long period of time.
Right.
And so there's this inherent conflict in my mind in how do you get cost recovery in a market that's so short-term focused. And so clearly, we all saw the news with retail customers paying bills in the thousands of dollars. And in my mind, it just exposes this issue of, did they really know and understand what kind of price risk they were taking on?
I like to, I don't know if I could interject. It's kind of like predatory mortgage lending we saw in the 2000, leading up to the 2008 financial bust, right? Did people really know what they were signing up for?
Yeah, fair point. It's one of those, again, where I think we could argue there were periods of time over the last several years where customers may have benefited under that structure as well. But is it the best in the long term, and did customers really understand the risk? That's a question I would pose.
I think different customers were affected differently as well. So you look at some of the larger industrial customers who can shut down operations for a couple days and be without that power, not subject themselves to those higher market prices. But for residential customers who are trying to heat their homes with electric power, it's a much different situation.
I think that's a very fair point, because fortunately for me, I got to watch 20 hours of Texas Senate hearings on the blackout. I say that as a kind of electricity dork, I was kind of interested in it. I was really interested in it, but at the end of I believe it was the first or second day in the Texas Senate, the Texas Association of Manufacturing representative got up there and was like, "Hey, we're all set. We don't think we need to do any changes." And that goes to the point you're making, Chris. Is like it took a sophisticated industrial consumer to manage the crisis, unlike a regular consumer could not do.
Thanks, Paul. Kira, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, a few thoughts, because I really think that the deregulation ended up playing a pretty significant part in what happened with the outages and the impacts to customers, because not having a regulator who is concerned and caring about customers and, frankly, the health of utilities means that nobody's enforcing that reserve margin. Nobody is making sure that the utilities in the state are building enough power to handle these kind of events, nor are they making sure that they have incentive to weatherize them. it is possible, we learned this in some of the reports out of Texas, to have better weatherized the natural gas facilities that ended up freezing and the pipelines. But within that short-term market where those are the only things driving the utilities activities, there's no incentive to engage in that kind of protection. So it really brought home for me how important regulation is to make sure that those type of events don't occur.
I keep thinking about the event in two very significant items, and you used the term earlier, Paul, affordability and reliability. And both things came to light in this one event, right? We talk about the very unfortunate circumstances with the rolling blackouts, extended days of being without power. But then for those that were able to get power and received it, incredible bills that they incurred afterwards. It's a pretty amazing event and complicated underneath for sure.
And so now ERCOT is suspending the energy providers being able to send out bills. Does anybody have thoughts on who's actually going to pay those costs now?
I think everything is evolving very quickly, and I hope deliberatively. I think there's going to be, I think it's very premature to speak to what will eventually happen to, will there be some kind of consumer protection imposed retroactively? I mean, no one knows. I mean, we're going to get into the weeds here. What kind of settlement situation is going to come across as far as who's paying what bills are getting processed from ERCOT? I mean, we're going to talk about Brazos in a minute, right? And what happened there with their bankruptcy. I mean, it's a, for lack of a better word, it's a mess across the board.
I was just thinking that. Okay. Yeah. Well, let's turn now to ERCOT and the wholesale market failures that are causing unfathomable financial damage. I'm going to read from an NPR story linked in the show notes and get your reactions. The largest power cooperative in Texas filed for bankruptcy protection Monday, citing a massive bill from the state's electricity grid operator following last month's winter storm that left millions of residents without power for days. Brazos Electric Power Cooperative filed for Chapter 11 in the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of Texas, according to court documents reviewed by NPR. The company in court documents says it received an essentially unpayable $1.8 billion bill from the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, the entity that maintains and operates much of the state's electricity grid. Brazos Electric is the wholesale energy provider for its 16-member cooperative. Brazos recovers its costs from its members, which collect from customers. The company said in its filing that to protect itself, its member cooperatives, and customers from a massive bill, it filed for bankruptcy. It said Brazos Electric will not foist this catastrophic black swan financial event onto its members and their customers and commence this bankruptcy to maintain the stability and integrity of its entire electric cooperative system. John, could you tell us how Dairyland is similar to Brazos, and could this ever happen here? And what's your overall reaction to this story?
Reaction to the event, surprise, and it's extremely unfortunate. And trying to comprehend how an organization that's a A-rated, strong credit entity in 1 week is filing for bankruptcy the next. Just an incredible set of circumstances. We're hopeful that as a cooperative that, Brazos into the restructuring, we don't know all the details. We're hopeful that they can work their way out of this. Again, we don't have all the details and facts surrounding their circumstances. But from my perspective, if you think about what happened in Texas, and we've talked about these high prices and the incredible bills, typically in that wholesale market, if the price goes very high, that's what you're having to pay to purchase the energy from ERCOT, in that case, to deliver it to your members. Typically, you would have offsetting revenue at that same high price from your generation. And so what I could envision is there may have been a set of circumstances where their generation was unavailable that might have led to these circumstances where they had a net amount owing potentially to ERCOT. Again, we don't have all the details as it relates, but I thought about this in context of the market prices, right? And Texas has set their scarcity pricing cap at $9,000 a megawatt hour. And in a market that might historically have been, even in the weeks before this event, in the $30, $40 per megawatt hour, that would be like us as consumers showing up at the gas pump on our next long distance trip on the way home, finding that you have to pay $600 a gallon. Just to put it in context, it's incredible. And how do you withstand that shock and absorb that type of event? So certainly in our case at Dairyland, we were very fortunate through this event. Our generation performed very, very well. We didn't see prices in MISO near as high as what they saw in ERCOT, but we did see high prices. Our generation performed very well. It was available, operating, and performing, largely owing to our crews. It's people that actually make that happen. It's the maintenance work, the planning, the preparation for the winter months, and we were able to perform. So in our case, we had the offsetting revenues from that generation to offset what we were paying MISO in those high price hours. Again, lots of facts I'm sure will come out of this. Very unfortunate, and we're very hopeful that Brazos will emerge from this in the end.
Thanks, John. Kira or Paul, any reactions?
My reaction mostly is that this is one of the problems with that kind of structure. You can't completely avoid this situation with a deregulated structure that is dependent on those hourly prices at any given moment in the market and just passes those directly on to the consumer. It's one of the flaws with energy choice and those kind of systems, because you don't have the protections for what is pretty universally recognized as an essential service for today's world.
Let's talk about grid resiliency and a word we've mentioned a couple times already, reliability. I've heard an insurance analogy used a couple times already reflecting on the Texas situation. So if Texas would have spent more on an insurance plan to weatherize generation infrastructure, they would have been more prepared for this extreme weather event. But insurance comes with costs. So let's discuss the grid updates that are needed as we all prepare for more extreme weather events. Thoughts on how much customers are willing to pay for such insurance?
2 years ago, I was testifying before a constitutional committee on the choice amendment that was going through the process before it got knocked off the ballot in Florida. After we had the discussion on the choice amendment, there was a move by the regulated utilities in Florida to move through the legislature, which was ultimately signed into law by Governor DeSantis and passed the legislature overwhelmingly, a grid resiliency measure. Because given Florida's situation as a peninsula sticking out into the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, the utilities out there were very worried about extreme climate events affecting the grid. And we all know, and it'd be interesting to see what happened economically in Texas with the outages, but in Florida, for every day of an outage, it resulted in $1 billion in lost economic activity after a hurricane. It's already the third largest state population-wise, but by 2030, there'll be another 5 million people living there. So folks that are relocating there and businesses that are relocating there need to know that they have a reliable supply of energy. And the grid resiliency measure that was ultimately moved through the legislature and signed into law by the governor, I like to refer to it as, for a little bit of investment on the front end, you got dividends in the back end with increased resiliency and decreased downtime after extreme Category 5 event that quite frankly, I don't think would happen in a deregulated market where, a company like Griddy doesn't have a vested interest in making sure the poles and wires are put back in a timely fashion after an extreme weather event. So yeah, resiliency is a big deal, particularly when it comes to economic activity.
And Kristen, I think those kind of insurance type costs for that weatherization, I think consumers really are willing to pay those because they especially see what can happen if you don't have it. And in Wisconsin, we know it's going to get that cold. We know that we can expect this, and it would be weird for it not to get that cold. So we have to build into those costs on the front end in the construction. And the issue is customers get to pay for that over time. If they had to pay everything in one lump sum, it's almost no different than the $10,000 bills that they're getting right now for these costs. But in a regulated system, you get to amortize that and spread it out over a period of time. And then I think that helps make that less impactful in any given month.
The way I see it, it's not as much about a willingness to pay in that really consumers expect that reliable service to be there when it's needed most. A polar vortex, something like that. And I think Kira makes a great point that you have this kind of dichotomy in the case of Texas, that it's also, we talked about it earlier, this retail choice and the drive to be the least cost supplier. So there's almost an inherent conflict at times to be in position to be that least cost provider, but also incur the costs necessary to be the most reliable provider. And there's a balance that needs to be struck, and in this case, it wasn't.
And I think, given what happened, one of the key aspects of the Florida statute that was signed into law almost 2 years ago, was that there was a provision that, if you will, triage the communities that were most at risk to, I guess, low reliability, in that it hit. So if you had, generally speaking, the communities in Florida that had the undergrounded distribution system, or the hardened, if you will, transmission system, were in the wealthier communities. This particular legislation said, hey, we're going to go in and look at all the communities and see which community has the old distribution system. With, at times, the greatest thing about the bill would have been just going in there with the vegetation management and making sure that the trees weren't hitting the above ground distribution system. So in that regulated marketplace, it was a bill that was passed that made sure that across the board, the costs were spread across the whole rate base, so that communities that needed it the most got it done quickly, and that the whole system became more reliable as a result of that.
Paul, that really struck something with me. And I think as we talk about like energy justice, environmental justice issues, that's really something to consider. I mean, I was going to ask, just as you started talking, what is the role of undergrounding, and what does sort of the grid of the future look like? That really should give policymakers here something to think about. Kira, what do you think?
Yeah, I think undergrounding can provide significant benefits because it insulates, literally, so many of these problems by putting the wires underneath so that ice doesn't form on them, and then trees can't fall on them, and it makes a significant difference overall in the level of reliability. It's occasionally logistically difficult depending on what service territory you're in and how much you have to disrupt in order to get that to occur, but it has a lot of benefit.
In talking with all the managers, if you will, of the distribution and transmission systems, it turns out to be like vegetation management, as uncool as it is, it seems to be the number one thing for reliability. Particularly in a state, take the Southeast, very humid, lots of rain, lots of trees. And it's hard to get that vegetation management done in some communities who love their trees, but it's important for reliability for sure.
It's a great conversation. And the topic in this case, and my understanding of in the case of Texas, and I may be wrong, but I didn't get the impression that it was really a line-driven issue so much in this event as it was a generation availability issue more so. But certainly there's a balance. You can try to hurricane-proof a system. Will that help you when you have a winter event like this in Texas and that far south, that long of a sustained event? Maybe not. I'm back to that. There's a balance in there somewhere. You have to balance the costs and the risks, and it's not an easy thing to do.
I agree, and you're absolutely right that it was more of a generation failure in Texas. Someone has brought up to me the derecho in Iowa last summer, and they had sustained power outages there as well. Obviously, Iowa is a regulated state, so that case was much different than this one. But at any rate, you always want to be asking, how can we best protect customers? And so that's why I ask about some of these resiliency and reliability measures, how they relate to customers.
I mean, I guess you have to ask yourself, does a company that's just, a company like Gritty, right? A Gritty has been in the news for better or for worse. Does it have an inherent interest in making sure that the infrastructure that it doesn't own is up and running? Now, I guess you could say yes, because its customers aren't receiving reliable electricity, then yes, it does have an inherent interest. But when you don't own it and you don't maintain it, do you have as much of an inherent interest?
So despite attempts by some to blame the system outages in Texas on renewable energy, it's clear that gas lines were also frozen, coal piles were frozen, and a nuclear plant experienced some frozen pipes that shut it down as well. So there were generation failures from almost all sources. Still, does this create worry or confusion about the role of renewable energy moving forward? And was any generation source the clear winner or loser coming out of this?
Oh, I can sure jump in. So I don't think it was a matter of generation winners and losers. And I certainly would say I don't think it would be reason for us to pause as we think about utilizing wind, solar, storage options more. I think in the case of Texas, it was more about a summer versus winter issue. Texas prepares largely for a peak demand that comes in the summer months. And as we've all acknowledged, this was a very unusual weather event, number one, to be that far south and as cold as it was for such a long time. But in the case of Texas, if you think about what happened and really across the country, when you have these extended cold weather outbreaks, the natural gas pipeline system is at near full capacity serving home heating demand. And so power plants that might be there able to produce to meet that summer peak might find it more of a challenge during those winter months. I think that played a role in this, but again, in my view, it boils down to making sure you have a diverse resource base that can meet that mix. That's a combination of renewables and other sources.
I would say the same thing. I wouldn't place the blame on any one resource failing because it was a across the board failure. And what was really interesting that came out of those hearings was that chair of the Texas Railroad Commission, which is it's a misnomer if there ever was one, because it's pretty much should be the Texas Oil and Gas Commission. She said that, this Chairman Craddock said that a lot of the natural gas compressors failed because they're winterized by electricity. The gas compressors weren't on the same level of priority as some other load. And so it's like a chicken and egg thing. Energy fairness, we wrote last year about 2019, 2020 about how there was how the Texas Municipal Authority took offline a 470 megawatt Gibbons Creek coal station. And we were worried about that because of the effect that it would have on reliability. Understood why they did it in the Texas marketplace, because it just wasn't viable economically to keep it, I guess, not even in mothballs, just there. And so, but then a year later, they had to bring it back online for electric reliability purposes. So yeah, it's a long way of saying, yes, there was not resource adequacy, and you can't point the finger at any one particular resource that failed. Although I do think that once folks started pointing the finger at wind, the pendulum swung all the way the other way. And it was like wind did no wrong when it went down to 1 megawatt, I think at one point. I think it was at 1% of its potential. So it was a resource adequacy problem and a reserve margin problem. And John's absolutely right. I mean, the system has always been a system that planned for peak load in July and August, not 75,000 megawatts of power during a polar vortex.
And piggybacking off of Paul's comments there, the other aspect, I think, of Texas's situation was its relative isolation. This is where its choice to not be interconnected to the rest the country, either as part of the Eastern Interconnect or the Western side, was harmful. when this type of weather event comes through, that's one of the benefits of getting to draw on those other geographic areas that aren't necessarily experiencing exactly the same thing. And I was a little extra annoyed that wind got blamed first, because in our polar vortex, the real deep one from a couple of years ago, wind actually performed phenomenally when a lot of the other fossil sources really didn't, because they had that same coal piles freezing and some of the same issues with gas. So it's not fair to single out any one resource.
So as states and the federal government set new climate goals, what should they learn from this situation?
If I can jump in, at some level, in my view, it's about thoughtful, planned, and ensuring again that it's resource diversification. We monitored data through this event ourselves, looking at how MISO was performing, how our own fleet was performing. And during those 2-3 really cold weeks in February, in MISO, fossil fuel resources were providing 75% of the total demand. That's a hard fact to ignore. In my view, again, it's not a reason to not proceed with more wind and solar and looking at reducing our CO2 footprint. We think that's sound business. But again, I think I would emphasize planned, thoughtful, and make sure we do it in a way we can maintain that reliability. And again, just looking at this recent event, the coldest days of the year, we relied on fossil fuel to meet 75% of the demand. And so moving away from that rapidly, in my mind, there is some risk in doing that. And we have to think that through.
We've been blogging for over 10 years about how great wind and solar are, particularly at the utility scale level. But we have also been pointing out that it's an intermittent resource. And to this day, although storage capacity has come a long way, 95% of energy storage is still through the process of pumped hydro storage. And pumped hydro storage has seen a bit of a renaissance because of its need to complement renewable resources, or I should say intermittent renewable resources. But still, there's still a ways to go with battery storage, and I think we're making tremendous strides. I mean, we've seen over the last couple of years, particularly down in Florida, there's going to be a new utility scale solar paired with storage, almost base load type facility. That's going to be the world's largest. But yes, we still need to have this all of the above approach when it comes to affordable and reliable power. And as John pointed out, I believe in MISO and even in SPP, the coal resources that were that came into the system during the tremendous cold snap that we've had, not just in Texas, but through the whole central region of the country, were invaluable at keeping the lights on. And I hate to say it, but just whether it's been in this role or as a government relations person, talking about reliability, I mean, when you talk about it to policymakers, their eyes glass over because they don't think the lights are ever going to go out, because as utilities do a great job 99% of the time keeping the lights on. It's like, you guys will figure it out. But you know what happens? The lights go out, boy, the broadband goes out too. Then they start to worry about it. And so it's one of those issues. It is insurance at the end of the day. Reliability is insurance.
All right, so now for the final question. If you had all the power in the industry, what would your first order of business be?
From my viewpoint, as a nonprofit trying to have these conversations with policymakers and consumers, right? It's education, education, education. Keep trying to tell folks that, look, yes, renewables are a wonderful thing. And we need to reduce our carbon emissions, and we're getting there. And utilities are setting wonderful goals, but it's not just going to be renewables that keep the system reliable, because at the end of the day, that's what consumers want. At the end of the day, we want to be able to go to our wall and flip the switch and keep the lights on and have the lights go off. And that's what John wants to do. He wants to be, at the end of the day, make sure that his distribution cooperatives have the power they need to make sure that their consumers, their member owners, you can tell how long I spent in co-op world, can't you? Their member owners have their affordable and reliable power. And I would just say we need to keep educating that renewables are coming, but it's going to take a myriad of energy resources and techniques like carbon capture and utilization and sequestration, and all these things to make sure that we keep the system reliable while reducing carbon emissions at the same time, and most importantly, or just as important, keeping electricity affordable.
So the question, if I had all the power, what would my first order of business be? I'm going back to an earlier answer that I gave, or a similar theme, and what I would encourage is that as we proceed down the path of reducing our CO2 intensity, that we do it in a manner that ensures we're diversified, and we do it in a way that's thoughtful, well-planned, and protects system reliability and costs. In my mind, it's back to a balance. I think the way that we were able to get through this recent event in the upper Midwest in particular is because we have a balanced portfolio, because it's been put in place and it's been a thoughtful and planned exercise. And as we transition ahead and look at ways to further reduce CO2, that continued planned, thoughtful transition needs to be front and center.
I do love this question, and also don't feel like I'm going to do it justice with this answer. But I would encourage creativity. We haven't faced as an industry many of the things that are happening right now in terms of the level of change on the supply side, introduction of new markets, people having to figure out how to work together differently. And I think our old ways of doing things are not necessarily going to serve us in this new world. I wish I had all the answers for it and could have offered that instead of just encouraging creativity. But I think collectively, all of our individual interests need to look for ways to work together more creatively and in ways that results in more everybody wins situations rather than any one particular subset.
I love that answer. Thanks, Kira. All right, any other closing thoughts?
Just thanks to my peers here. It was a privilege, an opportunity to serve on the panel with all of you. And Kristen, thanks for having me on the program.
Yeah, echo that.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again to our panel for that thoughtful discussion. Thanks also to all of our listeners, and as always to the members of the Customers First Coalition. Our founding members include the Municipal Electric Utilities of Wisconsin, Renew Wisconsin, Dairyland Power Cooperative, the Citizens Utility Board, the IBEW 2150, the Wisconsin Electric Cooperative Association, WPPI Energy, and Madison Gas and Electric. Don't forget, you can follow The Electric Wire on Twitter @TheElectricWire, or download and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll see you back here in April.